The air in the 50th floor boardroom of Blackwood Holdings didn't just feel expensive, it felt pressurized, like a diving bell sinking too fast into the dark. Sunlight glinted off the steel and glass exterior of the Midtown Tower, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and the predatory silence of men who measured their worth in the wreckage of others. Nia stood at the edge of the massive mahogany table, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the knot of her silk scarf. She had spent the last 4 days perfecting the art of the ghost, moving through the office with the quiet efficiency of someone who didn't want to be noticed, yet her ribs screamed with every shallow breath she took. David Morrison sat 3 seats away, his fingers tapping rhythmically on a leather-bound folder. To the rest of the board, he was the picture of corporate success, but to Naya, he was the man who had slammed her against a concrete pillar in the parking garage 96 hours ago. Every time he glanced her way, his smile turned into something jagged and ugly, a silent reminder that if she spoke, he would finish what he started. Nia swallowed against the dry, metallic taste of fear, her vision beginning to swim as she focused on the glowing screen of her laptop. She just had to survive this merger. She just had to get through the next hour. Then the double doors at the end of the room swung open, and the pressure in the room shifted from heavy to absolute. Minho didn't walk into the room so much as he reclaimed it. Standing at 6'3" with shoulders that seemed to broaden the hallway behind him, the lead investor moved with a controlled, lethal grace that made the other executives look like children playing at war. He wore a custom charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nia's annual salary, but it was the glimpses of ink at his collar, intricate, traditional Korean designs, that drew the eye. He was the Dragon of Manhattan, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency in the boardroom was only rivaled by the whispers of his shadow empire in the underworld. The CEO, Marcus Thorne, stood up with a fawning smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Kang, we're honored. We have the final data projections ready for your review." Minho didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at the leather chairs or the city skyline. His dark, intense eyes swept the room once and locked onto Nia. While the others saw a brilliant analyst ready to deliver a PowerPoint, Minho saw the way her knuckles had turned white as she gripped the table. He saw the slight tremor in her hands and the way she winced when she reached for a document. Most of all, he saw the beads of sweat on her forehead that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "Proceed," Minho said, his voice a low, melodic growl that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. He sat at the head of the table, leaning back with an air of casual dominance, his tattooed knuckles resting on the polished wood. Nia stepped forward, her heart hammering against her fractured ribs like a trapped bird. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. As you can see on the first slide, the projected synergy for this merger." Her voice cracked, a tiny sound of vulnerability that seemed to echo in the silence. She saw David Morrison lean forward, his eyes narrowing in a silent threat, and the room began to tilt. Minho's gaze never wavered from her face. He wasn't looking at the charts or the numbers. He was watching her struggle for air, his jaw tightening as he registered the sheer effort it took for her to remain standing. He saw the ghost of a bruise peeking out from beneath the makeup on her jawline, and the cold, professional mask he wore began to crack, revealing a sliver of the monster beneath. "Miss Collins," Minho interrupted, his voice cutting through her presentation like a blade. "You seem uncomfortable." "I'm fine, sir," Nia whispered, her vision tunneling as the fluorescent lights turned into blinding white halos. "The data indicates a 12% increase in—" "I don't care about the 12%, Minho said, standing up slowly. The room went dead silent. David Morrison shifted in his seat, his confidence suddenly replaced by a flicker of unease. Nia tried to take one more breath, but the pain in her chest surged, sharp and suffocating. The world spun violently, the mahogany table rising up to meet her. She felt herself falling, the sound of her own name being called by Thorn fading into a distant hum. She expected the hard, unforgiving impact of the floor, the final indignity in a week of horrors. Instead, she hit iron. Massive, powerful hands caught her mid-fall, pulling her against a chest that felt as solid as a mountain. Strong arms wrapped around her, lifting her like she weighed nothing, shielding her from the prying eyes of the men who had broken her. As Nia's eyes fluttered, she found herself staring into the face of the dragon. Up close, Minho was terrifyingly handsome, but his expression was one of pure, unadulterated fury. His hand cupped her face, his tattooed thumb brushing against the sweat on her skin. He didn't look at the CEO or the board members who were now standing in panicked confusion. He looked only at Nia, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a sanctuary. "I've got you," he said, the command in his tone absolute. "You're safe now." Then he looked up at the room, and the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. He saw the way David Morrison was staring at her, the guilt written in the man's sweat-slicked brow. Minho didn't need a confession. He was a predator who could smell the blood on the wind. He adjusted his hold on Nia, pulling her closer as his suit sleeve retracted, revealing a dragon tattoo that seemed to writhe with his movement. "The meeting is over," Minho announced, his voice cold enough to freeze the air in their lungs. "And so is this firm." He turned and walked out of the boardroom, carrying her like a treasure he had just reclaimed from a den of thieves, leaving 20 of the most powerful men in the city frozen in the wake of a war they didn't even know had begun. The transition from corporate analyst to a headline in every tabloid in Seoul happened in the span of a single heartbeat. In the boardroom, the silence that followed Nia's collapse was deafening, broken only by the sharp intake of breath from the executives who watched their carefully constructed reality shatter. Marcus Thorne and David Morrison stood paralyzed, their faces a pale mask of shock, as they watched the lead investor, the man they had intended to swindle, discard a multi-billion-dollar contract like a piece of refuse to catch a woman who was supposed to be invisible. Minho's arms were a cage of warm steel. As he pulled Nia against his chest, his blazer shifted, exposing the intricate dark ink of a tiger's stripes, winding down his forearm to his knuckles. He didn't look at the spreadsheets. He didn't look at the projections. His entire universe had narrowed down to the girl gasping for air in his embrace. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin through her thin blouse, and more disturbingly, the way her body winced even in unconsciousness. "Mr. Kang, please, she's just overworked," Thorne stammered, stepping forward with a trembling hand extended. "Our medical team is on the way. There's no need to—" Minho's head snapped up. The look in his eyes wasn't that of a businessman, it was the look of a reaper who had found his next mark. "Don't touch her," he hissed, the sheer weight of his voice pinning Thorne to the spot. "If you take one more step toward her, I will consider it an act of aggression against the House of Kang." The room froze. To the board, Minho was a high-tier investor. But in that moment, the dragon was no longer hiding. The suit remained, but the predator had taken the wheel. Minho shifted his grip, lifting Nia with an effortless display of strength that made her look fragile, a broken porcelain doll caught in the claws of a beast. As he turned toward the exit, the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the scene perfectly, a tableau of power and protection that would, within minutes, be leaked to every news outlet by a panicked junior associate. He didn't wait for the elevator. His private security team, men who moved like shadows in tactical gear, burst through the doors to clear a path. Minho walked through the lobby of Blackwood Holdings, ignoring the gasps of the staff and the flash of smartphone cameras. He didn't care about the optics. He only cared about the way Nia's head rested against his shoulder, her breaths coming in ragged, painful hitches. By the time he reached the blacked-out armored SUV waiting at the curb, the image had already gone viral. "The dragon catches the ghost," the headlines would read. a nameless analyst and the city's most dangerous enigma. The city began to buzz with the scandal, wondering why a man who dealt in blood and billions would risk his reputation for a girl who was meant to be a scapegoat. Inside the vehicle, the chaos of the city was silenced by soundproof glass. Minho laid Nia across the leather seat, his hand surprisingly gentle as he checked her pulse. His fingers brushed against the hem of her blazer, and as the fabric shifted, he saw it, the dark, mottled purple of a fresh bruise blooming across her ribs, stark against her skin. It wasn't the mark of an accident. It was the mark of a fist. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat, a sound that made his driver's shoulders tense. Minho looked out the window at the towering Blackwood building, his eyes burning with a cold, calculated fire. They thought they could break her to save themselves. They thought she was a nobody. He wouldn't notice. "Change of plans," Minho said into his intercom, his voice devoid of any humanity. "We aren't going to the clinic. Take us to the estate. Call Dr. Kim. Tell him I need a forensic exam, not just a checkup." He reached out, his tattooed hand covering Nia's smaller, colder one. The war hadn't just started. It had become personal. As the SUV roared away from the curb, leaving the corporate world in his rearview mirror, Minho made a silent vow. He would burn every floor of that building until there was nothing left but ash, and then he would find the man who had laid a finger on her and show him what it truly meant to be broken. Nia remained deep in the darkness of her faint, unaware that the world she knew was already being dismantled, and that the monster holding her hand was the only thing standing between her and the abyss. The transition from the suffocating gray of the boardroom to the silent golden warmth of the penthouse was a blur of pain and shadows. When Nia finally drifted back to consciousness, it wasn't the harsh scent of industrial cleaner or the hum of office fluorescent lights that greeted her. Instead, it was the smell of expensive sandalwood, crisp linen, and the distant rhythmic crash of waves against a private shoreline. She moved her arm, and the movement sent a white-hot spark of agony through her side, forcing a jagged gasp from her throat. "Don't move. The ribs are cracked, not just bruised." The voice was like velvet pulled over gravel, low, dark, and vibrating with an authority that made her heart skip. Nia opened her eyes, blinking against the soft amber glow of a room that felt larger than her entire apartment. She was lying in a bed that felt like a cloud, draped in silk sheets that cost more than her 6-month bonus. Beside the bed, sitting in a wingback chair with his suit jacket discarded and his white sleeves rolled to the elbows, was Minho. Under the dim light, the tattoos on his arms seemed to breathe. Intricate dragons and sharp traditional calligraphy coiled around his muscles, disappearing beneath the cuffs of his shirt. He looked less like a billionaire investor now, and more like a king presiding over a battlefield. In his hand was a glass of amber liquid, but his focus was entirely on her. "Where am I?" Nia whispered, her voice sounding thin and brittle. "In the only place in this city where you are safe," Minho replied. He set the glass down and leaned forward, the light catching the sharp angles of his jaw. "Dr. Kim treated you while you were out. He gave you something for the pain, but the damage is extensive. You've been playing the martyr for a long time, Nia." The use of her first name sent a shiver down her spine. In the office, she was Miss Collins. A cog, a ghost, a file number. Here, under the weight of his gaze, she felt exposed. She tried to pull the silk duvet higher, a reflexive gesture of modesty, but the movement made her wince again. Minho's expression didn't soften. It hardened into something terrifyingly cold. "The doctor found handprints on your arms. He found the bruising on your back from a concrete pillar. This wasn't a fall. This was an assault." He stood up, his presence filling the room, casting a long, jagged shadow against the far wall. "I want names, Nia." Nia swallowed hard, her mind racing back to David Morrison's sneering face in the garage, to Marcus Thorne's silent, complicit nod when she had tried to report the harassment. "It doesn't matter," she breathed, looking away. "They're powerful men. My contract has a non-disclosure clause, and the HR department, they said I misinterpreted the situation. If I speak, they'll ruin my father. They'll take everything." Minho crossed the room in 2 silent strides. He sat on the edge of the bed, not close enough to touch her, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You are still thinking in terms of corporate law and HR manuals," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silky whisper. "You think you are dealing with men who follow rules, but you are no longer in their world, you are in mine." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was surprisingly light, a stark contrast to the lethal power she knew he possessed. "They call me the dragon for a reason, Nia. I don't file lawsuits. I don't negotiate with predators. I remove them." The reality of her situation finally crashed over her. The rumors of the Korean syndicate that operated behind the veil of the Bellix Corporation weren't just office ghost stories. The man sitting on her bed was the head of the serpent, a man who moved mountains and silenced enemies with a single word. She was being protected by the very person the rest of the world feared most. "David Morrison," she whispered, the name finally escaping her lips like a curse, "and Marcus Thorne. They used me to hide the embezzlement. When I found the trail, David, he wanted to make sure I knew my place." Minho's eyes turned into shards of obsidian. He didn't explode in rage. He became unnervingly still. It was the stillness of a predator that had just located its prey. "Morrison," he repeated, the name sounding like a death sentence in his mouth. "And Thorne, a manager who thinks he's a god and a CEO who thinks he's untouchable." He stood up and pulled a burner phone from his pocket, tapping a few commands. "Dante, bring the car, and tell the boys to prepare the warehouse. We have a debt to collect." "What are you going to do?" Nia asked, fear and a strange, dark spark of hope warring in her chest. Minho turned back to her as he reached for his discarded jacket. He looked at her one last time, his gaze lingering on the bandages peeking out from the neckline of the silk shirt she had been changed into. "I'm going to show them that they made a fatal mistake," he said, his voice flat and final. "They thought they could break a ghost. They didn't realize that ghost belonged to me." He walked toward the door, his silhouette tall and imposing against the light of the hallway. "Rest, Naya. By the time you wake up, David Morrison will be a memory, and the war for Blackwood Holdings will have its first casualty." The door clicked shut, leaving her in the golden silence of the sanctuary. Nia lay back against the pillows, her heart racing. She had spent years trying to be invisible to avoid the monsters, only to realize she had been caught by the apex predator of them all. And for the first time in 4 days, as the painkillers began to dull the ache in her ribs, she wasn't afraid of the dark. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and silence, but beneath the surface the gears of a lethal machine had begun to grind. Minho had left Nia in the care of a silent, stone-faced nurse, but his presence lingered in the air like the scent of an approaching storm. While Nia drifted into a restless, medicated sleep, the dragon's wrath moved from the gilded heights of the penthouse down into the rain-slicked gut of the city. In the back of a blacked-out sedan, Dante, Minho's most trusted shadow, watched the neon lights of Manhattan blur into long, bloody streaks against the window. Dante didn't look like a mobster. He looked like a high-end bodyguard, clean-cut and stoic. But the way he methodically checked the suppressed pistol in his lap suggested a much darker vocation. He had received the call from Minho 10 minutes after Nia had whispered the names. The orders were simple: remove the shield before striking the sword. The first name on the list wasn't Morrison or Thorne. It was Elias Vance, the firm's head of security. Nia had described him as the man who stood by the garage exit, leaning against a pillar with a smirk while Morrison's fists had connected with her ribs. Vance hadn't just allowed the abuse, he had curated the environment for it, ensuring the cameras were looped and the guards were on break. He was the gatekeeper of Blackwood's dirty secrets, and in Minho's eyes, that made him the most expendable. Vance was leaving a high-stakes underground poker club in Chelsea when the world ended for him. He was a large man, built like a bull and twice as stubborn, feeling invincible with a pocket full of winnings and the protection of the Blackwood name. He reached for his car door, his mind already on the drink he'd have at home, when a hand as cold as ice clamped over his mouth. Dante didn't waste words. He didn't offer a villainous monologue. He simply pressed the barrel of a weapon into Vance's kidney and whispered a single directive into his ear. "The dragon wants to have a word about the girl in the garage." Vance's bravado vanished instantly, replaced by a primal gut-wrenching terror. Everyone in the security world knew who the dragon was, and they knew that if his shadows were touching you, you were already a dead man walking. Before Vance could even draw a breath to plead, he was shoved into the back of a van that appeared from the darkness like a ghost. Back at the penthouse, Nia woke to the sound of a heavy door closing. The room was bathed in the blue light of pre-dawn. She sat up, her ribs throbbing with a dull, manageable ache, and saw Minho standing by the floor-to-ceiling window. He had changed into a black turtleneck and dark trousers, looking less like a CEO and more like the Reaper she suspected him to be. His knuckles were bruised, and there was a dark splash of something on his cuff that hadn't been there before. "He's gone," Minho said, his voice echoing in the vast empty space. He didn't turn around. "Who?" Nia asked, her voice trembling. "Elias Vance, the man who watched you get hurt and did nothing. The man who deleted the footage that would have put your manager in prison." Minho finally turned, and the intensity in his gaze made Nia's breath hitch. There was no regret in his eyes, only a cold, terrifying satisfaction. "He won't be returning to Blackwood Holdings. Or anywhere else." Nia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She had wanted justice, but the finality of Minho's version of it was staggering. "What did you do to him?" Minho walked toward the bed, stopping just at the edge of the light. "I ensured that he can never stand by and watch a woman bleed again. I've taken his silence, his career, and his freedom. He is currently being processed. By the time the sun is fully up, his disappearance will be the first tremor in the earthquake that is going to level Marcus Thorne's empire." He sat down, his hand resting on the mattress near her knee. Vance gave up everything before he broke. The offshore accounts, the encrypted emails, the names of the board members who took a cut of the embezzlement. But most importantly, he confirmed exactly what David Morrison did to you. Minho's fingers twitched, as if he were imagining his hands around a throat. "Thorne thinks he is safe because he has a security team and a legal department. He doesn't realize I've already cut the brakes on his life. You asked me earlier why I'm doing this, Nia. You think it's just business. It isn't." He leaned in closer, the scent of rain and iron clinging to him. "In my world, there are very few things that are sacred. But the people under my protection? They are the line. Your firm treated you like a sacrifice. I'm going to treat them like a warning." Nia looked at the man before her. The tattoos, the cold eyes, the blood-stained cuff, and realized that the war had moved past the point of no return. The security head had disappeared, and the vacancy would send a shockwave through the company that would leave David Morrison and Marcus Thorne exposed and terrified. "You're not just taking the company, are you?" Nia whispered. Minho leaned back, a small, dark smile playing on his lips. "I'm taking everything they value, their money, their power, and eventually, their breath. Sleep now, Nia. Tomorrow, the stock market opens, and the world will watch as Blackwood Holdings begins to bleed." As she laid her head back down, Nia realized she was no longer a victim of a corporate machine. She was the catalyst for a massacre. And as the dragon's hand briefly covered hers, she knew that while the city was about to burn, she was the only one who wouldn't feel the heat. The sun rose over Manhattan not as a herald of a new day, but as a spotlight on a crime scene that had yet to be cordoned off. Inside the penthouse, the air was silent and still, but on the screens of the monitors in Minho's private study, the world was screaming. The opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange hadn't even rung before the first strike landed. It wasn't a subtle move, a quiet shorting of stocks, or a behind-the-scenes merger. It was a systematic execution of the Blackwood Holdings Board of Directors, carried out with the surgical precision of a man who dealt in both digital code and physical consequences. Minho stood before a wall of glass, his reflection superimposed over the skyline he essentially owned. He held a tablet in one hand, his thumb hovering over a command that would finalize the erasure of a decade's worth of corporate greed. Behind him, Nia sat wrapped in a heavy silk robe, her eyes wide as she watched the data streams. She was seeing the numbers she had once meticulously managed for Thorne now being weaponized against him. "This is impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the servers. "You've triggered a margin call on 3 of the major shareholders simultaneously. Their personal assets are tied to the firm's valuation. If the stock drops another 5 points, they lose everything. Their homes, their offshore holdings, it all goes into probate." "It's only impossible if you play by the rules they wrote for you," Minho said, his voice a cold, resonant baritone. He didn't turn around. He was watching the ticker for Blackwood. It wasn't just dropping, it was hemorrhaging. "They used you to balance their books, Nia. They used your brilliance to mask their theft. All I'm doing is pulling back the curtain. I'm not stealing their lives. I'm simply making them pay the bill they've been running up for years." The hostile takeover was a misnomer. This wasn't a takeover. It was a liquidation of souls. By 10 a.m., the first board member, a man named Henderson who had once joked about Nia's pretty little head for numbers, found his private bank accounts frozen under a federal fraud investigation. Minho hadn't just leaked the embezzlement files Nia had found. He had funneled them directly to the one SEC investigator who couldn't be bought. By noon, the treasurer's wife had been served with divorce papers alongside a comprehensive list of her husband's indiscretions, information Dante had extracted from Vance's private servers before the security head had been relocated. One by one, the pillars of Blackwood Holdings were being kicked out from under the structure. It was a psychological blitzkrieg. Minho wasn't just taking their money, he was stripping away their identities, their reputations, and the hollow prestige they used as armor. He was making them feel exactly what Nia had felt in that parking garage: small, vulnerable, and utterly alone. "Why go this far?" Nia asked, standing up and moving toward him, her hand instinctively touching her side, where the pain was now a dull, thrumming reminder of her reality. "You could have just bought the shares. You have the capital. You could have fired them all." Minho finally turned, and the look in his eyes was something Nia would see in her dreams for years. It was a hunger, a dark and ancient thing that no custom suit could ever truly hide. He stepped toward her, his shadow falling over her like a heavy shroud. "If I just fire them, they walk away with their golden parachutes and their pride. They find another firm, another assistant to break, another life to ruin. That is business. That is the world Marcus Thorne understands." He reached out, his tattooed hand cupping her jaw, his thumb tracing the faint, fading mark of the bruise Thorne's manager had left. His touch was electric, a terrifying blend of tenderness and lethality. "I am not a businessman, Nia. I am a dragon. When someone steals from me, I don't ask for a refund. I take their wings. I want them to wake up in 48 hours and realize that the only thing they have left in this world is the fear of me. I want them to look at their empty bank accounts and their ruined names and know that it all happened because they touched the one thing they should have feared above all else." "Me," Nia whispered. You, Minho confirmed. A notification chimed on the tablet. Marcus Thorne was calling Minho's private line. The CEO was likely calling from a burning ship, desperate for a life raft, unaware that the man he was calling was the one holding the torch. Minho looked at the screen, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a smile that never reached his cold, predatory eyes. He didn't answer. He let it ring, the sound echoing through the penthouse like a funeral bell. "Let him wait," Minho said, tossing the tablet onto the sofa. "Let him watch the numbers fall. Let him feel the walls closing in. The fear is the most important part of the debt." He looked back at Nia, his gaze softening just enough to be dangerous. "You've spent your life being an asset to men who didn't deserve your shadow. Today, you are the reason a dynasty dies. How does it feel, Nia? To be the one holding the match?" Nia looked out at the city, at the Blackwood Tower in the distance, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt the weight of the power Minho was sharing with her, a dark, jagged thing that promised safety at the cost of her innocence. She looked at the tattoos on his arm, the dragon coiling toward his heart, and she realized she wasn't just witnessing a takeover. She was witnessing a coronation. "It feels like justice," she said, her voice finally steady. Minho's smile widened, sharp and predatory. "No, Nia. Justice is for the courts. This is vengeance. And we're just getting started." The golden hour was bleeding into a bruised purple over the Hudson River, casting long, distorted shadows across the penthouse floor. Nia found Minho on the expansive terrace. The glass doors slid wide to admit the biting chill of the New York winter. He had discarded his shirt, standing with his back to her, a silhouette of raw power etched against the glowing skyline. For a moment, Nia stopped breathing. This was the first time she was seeing the man behind the suit, the reality beneath the billionaire's facade. And the sight was staggering. His back was a sprawling canvas of ink and history. A massive, traditional dragon coiled from the base of his spine to the nape of his neck, its scales detailed with a precision that made them look like armor. It wasn't just decorative, it was a map of a life lived in the dark. Beside the dragon were tigers and old Hanja characters, some obscured by thin, white lines of scar tissue that told stories of blades and close calls. The tattoos weren't just on him, they were part of him. A second skin that declared his status in a world that didn't recognize corporate titles or legal boundaries. Minho didn't turn around, but he knew she was there. "In my culture, the dragon is a protector of the heavens," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "But even a protector must be feared to be effective. Every mark you see here represents a debt paid or a territory held. They are not just for show, Nia. They are a warning." Nia stepped closer, drawn by a terrifying curiosity. The cold air raised goosebumps on her skin, but the heat radiating from him was a physical force. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she stopped just inches from the dragon's head etched between his shoulder blades. "And what do they mean now? Now that you're the CEO of a global investment firm?" Minho finally turned, and the sheer intensity of his presence made her take a half step back. The tattoos continued across his chest and down his ribs, a masterpiece of violence and beauty. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a possessive fire that made the city lights behind him seem dull. "They mean that the man you see in the boardroom is a mask. They mean that the rules of the SEC and the laws of the land are secondary to the code I live by. In the world I come from, Naya, you don't protect what you love with lawyers and press releases. You protect it with blood." He moved toward her, his proximity overwhelming. The scent of sandalwood and iron was stronger here, mingling with the cold salt of the river. He reached out, his large, tattooed hand cupping the side of her neck, his thumb resting just beneath her jaw. The heat of his palm was a stark contrast to the winter air. "I told you once that you belong to me now," he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, guttural vibration. But you need to understand the weight of that. Being mine doesn't just mean a penthouse and a new job. It means that anyone who dares to look at you with the wrong intent is declaring war on the dragon. It means that if David Morrison so much as dreams of you, I will know, and I will erase him. This isn't a corporate contract, Nia. This is an ancient claim. Nia felt her heart hammering against her ribs, the ribs that were still mending, a constant reminder of why she was here. She looked up at him, at the sharp lines of his face and the lethal promise in his eyes. She should have been terrified. She should have run from the darkness he was offering. But as she looked at the tattoos that marked him as a monster, she realized she had never felt safer. The men at Blackwood, they saw me as an asset, she said, her voice growing stronger. They saw me as a tool to be used until it broke. And they are being dismantled for that mistake, Minho replied, his grip on her neck tightening just enough to be felt. I don't use assets, Nia. I claim territory. And you are the most valuable piece of ground I have ever stood upon. I've spent my life building an empire of fear so that I could have the power to keep the world away from what I choose to cherish. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The wind whipped around them, but in the circle of his arms, the world was perfectly still. Do you understand now? The war I'm fighting isn't for a stock price. It's for the right to ensure that no one ever makes you feel like a ghost again. I am marking this city with your name, Nia. By the time I am done, everyone from Wall Street to the docks will know that you are under the dragon's shadow. Nia closed her eyes, letting the darkness of his promise wash over her. She reached up, her hands finally making contact with the ink on his chest. His skin was hot, his heart beating a steady, relentless rhythm beneath her palms. She wasn't just a witness to his war anymore, she was the cause of it. And as Minho leaned down to press a kiss to her temple, a gesture of startling tenderness from a man built for violence, she realized that the mark of ownership wasn't on his skin. It was on hers. Then let them watch, she whispered. Minho's low, dark laugh vibrated through her. They won't just watch, Nia. They will tremble. He pulled her closer, shielding her from the wind with his tattooed body, a king and his queen standing on the edge of a world they were about to burn to the ground together. The war for Blackwood Holdings had moved from the shadowed terraces of the penthouse to the blinding, merciless light of the public eye. Marcus Thorne, cornered and desperate as his empire turned to ash, decided to play the only card he had left: the destruction of the girl who had witnessed his rot. By Tuesday morning, the city's major tabloids and financial blogs were flooded with a whistleblower report. It painted Nia not as a victim, but as the architect of the firm's embezzlement scheme. Thorne's PR team had been thorough. They leaked doctored emails and forged transaction logs that made it look as though Nia had been siphoning millions into offshore accounts while under the unstable influence of a criminal investor. Nia sat in the media room of the penthouse, her face pale as she watched her name crawl across the bottom of the news ticker. The world was calling her a thief, a social climber, and a mafia consort. They're going to believe them, she whispered, her hands clenching the armrests of her chair. Thorne has the connections. I'm just a face on a screen to them. Minho stood at the center of the room, his eyes fixed on a different screen, one that didn't show the news, but the back end of the Blackwood internal server. He looked entirely unbothered, his thumb tracing the line of his jaw. Thorne is an amateur, Minho said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He thinks the truth is something you can edit. He doesn't realize that in the digital age, a lie is just a temporary shield. And I'm about to shatter his. Minho tapped a key on his console, signaling Dante to initiate the counterstrike. Thorne spent 20 years building a reputation as a philanthropist and a pillar of the community. He thinks the public cares about your crimes, Nia. But the public is fickle. They would much rather watch a god fall than a ghost be haunted. While Thorne's camp was busy patting themselves on the back for a successful character assassination, Minho released the Kraken. He didn't send out a press release. He hijacked the narrative. Within minutes, every major news outlet received a massive encrypted file titled The Blackwood Archives. It wasn't just data. It was the footage Elias Vance had lost, the high-definition security recordings from the parking garage. The world watched in sickening detail as David Morrison assaulted Nia while Thorne looked on from a car window, checking his watch as if the violence were a mere scheduled inconvenience. But Minho didn't stop there. He released the private recordings from Thorne's own panic room, audio of the CEO laughing about the black analysts he could use as shields. And worse, the evidence of his involvement in a human trafficking ring that used the firm's logistics wings for transport. The shift in the room was palpable as the news cycle did a violent screeching U-turn. Thorne's face was no longer that of a victimized CEO. It was the face of a monster. "I didn't just want to clear your name, Nia," Minho said, walking over to her and resting a hand on her shoulder. His touch was heavy, grounding, and absolute. "I wanted to ensure that there is no hole deep enough for him to hide in. He tried to take your reputation. I am taking his humanity." Nia looked up at him, the glow of the monitors reflecting in her eyes. The fear that had gripped her all morning was being replaced by something sharper, a dark, triumphant heat. Thorne was no longer a threat. He was a carcass being torn apart by the very media he had tried to weaponize. "They're calling for his arrest," Nia noted, watching a live feed of protesters gathering outside the Blackwood Tower. "Arrest is too kind for a man like Marcus Thorne," Minho replied, his gaze returning to the screen. "The police will get what's left of him. But before they do, he will watch as his wife leaves him, his children disown him, and his peers spit on his name. He tried to make you a scapegoat, but he forgot one thing." Minho leaned down, his lips brushing against Nia's ear, his scent of sandalwood and cold iron enveloping her. "The dragon doesn't just protect his own, he hunts those who dare to touch them." Thorne thought he was playing a game of chess. He didn't realize I've been playing a game of extinction. As the stock for Blackwood Holdings hit zero and the first sirens began to wail in the distance toward the corporate tower, Nia realized the scapegoat's revenge wasn't just about survival. It was about the total, uncompromising erasure of those who had dared to hurt her. Minho hadn't just saved her. He had rebuilt the world in her image. And in that new world, the monsters were finally the ones afraid of the dark. The air inside the Pierre Hotel's grand ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of impending ruin. It was the annual Blackwood Gala, an event that usually celebrated the pinnacle of corporate excess, but tonight it felt like a wake. The crystal chandeliers vibrated with a low, nervous energy as the city's elite whispered behind champagne flutes, their eyes darting toward the entrance. They were waiting for the dragon. Nia moved through the crowd like a vision of vengeance. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her curves, the high slit revealing the steady stride of a woman who was no longer afraid to occupy space. The oversized blazer and the concealer were gone. She wore her history in the way she held her head. By her side, Minho was a silent, lethal shadow in a black-on-black tuxedo. He didn't mingle. He didn't smile. He simply walked with his hand resting possessively on the small of Nia's back, his presence a gravitational force that made the crowd part like the Red Sea. "Thorne is here," Minho whispered, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "He's in the VIP lounge. He thinks he has an exit strategy. He's wrong." Nia felt the prickle of adrenaline. She could see Marcus Thorne through the tinted glass of the upper mezzanine, surrounded by a skeleton crew of private security, men who looked far more comfortable with tactical rifles than cocktail napkins. Thorne looked haggard, his skin the color of ash, his eyes darting frantically. He had lost his company, his reputation, and his freedom, but he still had the desperate, cornered animal's instinct to bite. As Nia stepped away to retrieve a drink, The trap snapped shut. It happened with the synchronized precision of a staged play. The lights in the ballroom flickered and died, plunging the room into a chaotic, screaming darkness. In the heartbeat before the emergency generators kicked in, Naya felt a rough, gloved hand clamp over her mouth. A heavy arm wrapped around her waist, hoisting her off her feet. She didn't scream. She fought. She drove her heel into her captor's instep and threw her weight forward, but she was being dragged toward the service exit. "Keep her quiet," a voice hissed, Thorne's voice cracked and frantic. "She's the only leverage we have left. Get her to the car." The emergency lights hummed to life, casting a sickly red glow over the scene. Thorne stood by the service door, his tuxedo disheveled, a pistol trembling in his hand. Two of his hired mercenaries were shoving Nia toward the stairwell. The elite guests scrambled for the main exits, their polished world dissolving into primal fear. Then, a sound cut through the panic, the slow, heavy thud of footsteps echoing on the marble. Min-ho emerged from the shadows of the catering line. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket, and his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dragon's head coiling up his throat. He didn't look like an investor anymore. He didn't look like a CEO. The mask had been burned away, leaving only the mafia boss who had spent half his life in the blood-stained alleys of Seoul. "Marcus," Min-ho said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He continued to walk forward, ignoring the two mercenaries who leveled their weapons at his chest. "I gave you a chance to lose gracefully. I gave you the chance to go to a cell and live out your days in silence. But you chose to touch her again." "Stay back!" Thorne shrieked, pressing the barrel of his gun toward the crowd, then back to Naya. "I'll kill her. I swear to God, I'll end her right here." Min-ho didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. He reached into his waistband and pulled a heavy, matte black handgun, but he didn't aim it. He just held it at his side, his thumb clicking the safety off with a sound that felt like a falling guillotine. "You don't have the stomach for it, Marcus. You're a man who signs checks to have others do your dirty work. I'm a man who enjoys the scent of the iron." The mercenaries hesitated. They looked at the dragon tattoos coiling down Min-ho's arms, and they recognized a predator that outranked them in every sense of the word. Dante and three other shadows appeared on the balcony above, red laser dots suddenly blooming on the foreheads of Thorne's men. "Drop the girl," Min-ho commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a law of nature. In a blur of motion, Naya saw her opening. She bit down hard on the hand covering her mouth and slammed her elbow into the ribs of the man holding her, hitting the exact spot where her own ribs had been broken weeks ago. The mercenary grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. "Now!" Min-ho roared. The ballroom erupted. Min-ho moved with the speed of a striking cobra. He didn't just fire. He closed the distance in 3 predatory strides. He caught Naya's arm, spinning her behind his back in a single fluid motion, shielding her body with his own. The sound of suppressed gunfire was a series of sharp coughs. Thorne's mercenaries dropped before they could pull their triggers, neutralized by the marksman above. Thorne fell to his knees, his gun clattering to the floor as he stared up at Min-ho. The dragon loomed over him, the red emergency lights making the ink on his skin look like it was dripping with fresh blood. Min-ho grabbed Thorne by the collar and hauled him up, slamming him against the gold-leafed pillar. "You thought she was a tool," Min-ho hissed, his face inches from Thorne's. "You thought she was a piece of data you could delete. Look at her, Marcus. Look at the woman who destroyed you." Nia stepped forward from behind Min-ho's shadow. She looked at the man who had terrified her for years, who had broken her body and tried to steal her soul. He looked pathetic. He was a small, broken man hiding behind a title that no longer existed. "I'm not a ghost anymore, Marcus," Naya said, her voice steady and cold. "But you're about to become one." Min-ho looked at Naya, a silent question in his eyes. He was offering her the kill. He was offering her the final bloody piece of justice. Nia looked at Thorne, then back at the man who had burned a city down to save her. She reached out and placed her hand over Minho's fist, which was still constricted around Thorn's throat. "Don't get his blood on the floor," she said quietly. "The police are outside. Let them see what's left of him. The dragon has more important things to do." Minho's eyes softened, the lethal fire dimming just enough to let the man back in. He dropped Thorn like a piece of trash. "Dante!" he called out without looking back. "Hand him over to the authorities. Make sure the special evidence we found in his panic room is the first thing the DA sees." Minho turned to Nia, his hands finding her waist. He checked her over, his touch frantic and possessive, ensuring she hadn't been hurt in the scuffle. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, leaning into him, the scent of his cologne finally masking the smell of the lilies. "I'm more than fine." Outside, the sirens of half the NYPD wailed, but inside the ruined ballroom, the war was over. The investor mask was gone, the CEO was a memory, and as Minho led Nia out past the flashing cameras and the stunned socialites, the world finally knew the truth. The dragon had found his queen, and Manhattan would never be the same again. The transition from the shattered elegance of the gala to the industrial silence of Warehouse 3 was a descent into the raw, unvarnished heart of Minho's world. The air here didn't smell of lilies or expensive champagne. It smelled of salt, rusted iron, and the sharp, acidic tang of terror. High above, the rafters groaned under the weight of the winter wind, and a single, naked bulb flickered over the center of the concrete floor. Marcus Thorne was strapped to a heavy steel chair, his once immaculate tuxedo now shredded and stained with the filth of his own cowardice. He looked small beneath the towering ceilings, a broken puppet whose strings had been cut by a master who didn't believe in mercy. When the heavy rolling doors of the warehouse creaked open, the sound echoed like a gunshot. Minho entered first, his silhouette long and predatory against the moonlight. He had discarded his shirt entirely now, the dragon on his back appearing to writhe as he moved through the shadows. Behind him walked Nia. She had traded her evening gown for dark trousers and a heavy wool coat, her face a mask of cold, focused obsidian. She no longer looked like the girl who had collapsed in the boardroom. She looked like the person who had survived the fire and learned to love the heat. "He's all yours, Nia," Minho said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He stepped to the side, leaning against a stack of shipping crates, his tattooed arms crossed over his chest. He was the spectator now, the dark power standing by to ensure that whatever debt was collected, it was paid in full. Thorne looked up, his eyes bulging with a desperate, frantic hope when he saw her. "Nia, please," he wheezed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "I have money. I have accounts they haven't found yet. 10 million. 20. I'll give it all to you. Just tell him to let me go. I was pressured. Morrison. He was the one who—" Nia walked until she was standing inches from him. She didn't flinch at the sight of his broken face. She looked at the man who had authorized her silence with a shrug, the man who had watched her ribs break and worried only about his quarterly projections. "You think this is about money, Marcus?" she asked, her voice as sharp and clean as a scalpel. "You think my life has a price tag that fits into your ledger?" "Everything has a price!" Thorne shrieked, his voice cracking. "Please, Nia, I'm an old man. Prison will kill me. Have mercy." Nia leaned down, her shadow swallowing him. "You didn't have mercy in the parking garage. You didn't have mercy when you forged those documents to make me a criminal. You didn't even have mercy for the women you trafficked through your logistics line." She reached out, her fingers grazing the heavy steel of the chair. "You aren't afraid of death, Marcus. You're afraid of being a nobody. You're afraid of the world knowing that without your title and your money, you are nothing but a small, pathetic thief." She turned back to Minho, who was watching her with an expression of dark, prideful intensity. "He wants mercy," she said quietly. "And what do you want, Nia?" Minho asked. He didn't move, but the air in the warehouse seemed to tighten. One word from you, and he never leaves this room. I can make him disappear so completely that even the earth will forget his name. Or, I can give him to the men waiting outside, the ones with badges and a very long list of his crimes. He will spend every second of the rest of his life in a 6x9 cage, knowing that the nothing he tried to break is the person who took his son away. Thorne began to sob, a pathetic wet sound that filled the empty space. Nia, please, don't let them take me. Kill me if you have to, but don't let me rot in there. Nia looked at him one last time. She saw the monster that had haunted her dreams, and she realized he was already dead. The man who had ruled Midtown was gone. Only the shell remained. To kill him now would be a kindness, a quick end to a story that deserved to be a slow, agonizing crawl. Justice isn't a bullet, Marcus, Nia said, her voice echoing with a finality that chilled the room. Justice is the weight of every life you ruined sitting on your chest for the next 30 years. I don't want your blood on my hands. I want your name to be the curse that people whisper when they talk about the fall of Blackwood. She looked at Minho and nodded. Give him to the authorities. Let the world see him in orange. Let him watch from a prison television as I take his chair, his company, and his legacy. Minho's eyes flashed with a lethal approval. He uncrossed his arms and whistled once, a sharp, piercing sound. From the shadows, Dante and two other men appeared, their movements silent and efficient. They unbolted the chair from the floor, ignoring Thorne's renewed screams for a quick end. You chose well, Minho said, walking over to Nia as the enforcers dragged the screaming former CEO toward the waiting police perimeter. He wrapped a heavy, tattooed arm around her shoulders, pulling her into the warmth of his side. Death is an escape. Living with the consequences of crossing the dragon, that is a special kind of hell. Nia leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the tail lights of the van disappear into the New York fog. The debt was paid. The ghost was gone. She felt a strange, profound lightness in her chest, as if the fractured ribs had finally fused back together, stronger than they had ever been. Is it over? She asked. Minho kissed the top of her head, his grip tightening. For them, it's over. For us, Nia, the world is just beginning to wake up. As they walked out of the warehouse, leaving the darkness behind, Nia realized she hadn't just survived the war. She had won it. And as she climbed into the car with the man who had burned an empire for her, she knew that whatever came next, she would never have to hide her scars again. The 50th floor of the Blackwood Tower, now rebranded under the stark, minimalist crest of the Kang Syndicate, no longer felt like a diving bell. The air was crisp, scented with expensive cedar and the cold, sharp ozone of a new era. The mahogany table, once a battlefield where Nia had bled in silence, had been polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the morning sun that poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Nia stood at the head of that table. She was no longer dressed in the oversized blazers of a woman trying to disappear. She wore a structured suit of charcoal wool, her hair pulled back in a sleek, uncompromising style that highlighted the sharp, steady clarity in her eyes. The glasses she once used as a shield were gone. She wanted to see every flinch, every nod of respect, and every shadow in the room. Before her sat the remaining department heads and the new board members, men and women who had been vetted not for their pedigree, but for their loyalty and their fear. She didn't wait for them to settle. She didn't ask for their attention. She simply placed her hands on the table and leaned forward, the silence in the room absolute. 6 months ago, this room was a sanctuary for predators, Nia began, her voice calm, resonant, and devoid of the tremor that had once defined her. You managed assets by breaking people. You balanced books with blood. That era ended the moment Marcus Thorne was led away in zip ties. This firm is no longer an investment house. It is the legitimate face of an empire. You will find that my standards for excellence are higher than thorns, and my tolerance for mistakes is non-existent. A heavy, grounding presence moved behind her. Minho stepped out of the shadows by the window, moving with that familiar, predatory grace. He didn't take a seat. He didn't need one. He stood directly behind Nia's chair, his large, tattooed hands resting on the leather backrest. He wore a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the dragon on his arm seemingly keeping watch over the room. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His presence was the ultimate endorsement, a silent promise that the woman speaking was the only voice that mattered. Nia felt the heat of him at her back, a pillar of iron and ink that had become her sanctuary. For months, she had feared that being protected by him meant losing herself. But as she looked at the fearful, attentive faces of the executives, she realized the truth. Minho hadn't just saved her. He had given her the throne she was always brilliant enough to occupy, then burned away the vermin that stood in her way. The restructuring is complete, Nia continued, sliding a digital tablet across the polished wood. The logistics wing has been purged. The embezzlement holes have been plugged. We are moving into emerging markets in Seoul and Singapore. You will report to me. I will report to the chairman. She glanced back at Minho, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes softened into something ached and proprietary. It wasn't the gaze of a boss, but of a partner. He looked at her not as a trophy he had won, but as the only person in the world capable of standing beside him without trembling. The meeting was brief. When the executives filed out, moving with a newfound sense of urgency, the heavy double doors clicked shut, leaving Nia and Minho alone in the sky. Nia exhaled, a long, slow breath that finally released the last ghost of the girl who had collapsed on this very floor. She turned around, and Minho was already there, reaching out to cup her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch a familiar grounding electric pulse. "You handled them well, my queen," he whispered, his voice a low, dark vibration. "They are terrified of you." "They should be," Nia replied, leaning into his palm. "I know where all their bodies are buried. I'm the one who dug the holes." Minho let out a short, dark laugh and pulled her into his arms, shielding her from the vastness of the city outside. He tucked her head beneath his chin, his tattooed arms wrapping around her in a possessive, unbreakable circle. "You've come a long way from the ghost in the designer suit." "I had a good teacher," Nia said, looking up at the dragon coiling toward his throat. "You taught me that some things are worth going to war for." "And you were the only thing worth the fire," he countered, his gaze locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering devotion. Nia looked out at the New York skyline, the empire they had built together sprawling out toward the horizon. The bruises were long gone, the broken ribs had healed into iron, and the fear had been forged into power. She was no longer a victim of the shadows. She was the one who controlled them. Standing at the top of the world, held by the most dangerous man in the city, Nia finally understood that her collapse hadn't been an end. It had been the violent, beautiful beginning of everything. The dragon had his lair, but Nia held the keys. And in this new empire, built on vengeance and bound by blood, they would never have to hide in the dark again.